Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Honor Moore, and I'm the Dean of Gratz College. I'm also the Director of the EDD in Educational Leadership. I want to welcome you all on behalf of Dr. Elif, our President, and all our faculty and staff to our Summer Institute. This year's topic is, I think, something that's very timely for all of us. It's futurism, how educators can lead in the 21st century. We invite you to imagine the future as you see it in whatever type of education you're either involved in or interested in, have read about, or just thinking about. And think about whether you feel prepared for what's coming in the years ahead. We hope that this 2.5 days of workshops and inspiring lectures will help us all to come up with ideas that we think we should be doing, things we can be doing to make sure that education has a firm and solid foundation as we move ahead in the decades to come. I'm now going to turn this over to Donna Garin, our library director, who will introduce today's very exciting keynote speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Honor. This year's Summer Institute 2023, we're so glad to have you with us. This year, we're asking you to imagine yourself as futurists. As educators and professionals, our work and the way we interact with others will continue to evolve. Our curriculums and the necessary skills needed to lead and our changing environments and modes of delivery will continue to evolve and be different. Are you prepared? From climate change and sustainability to new modes of leadership and the fight for equality and against anti-Semitism, we have invited a diverse group of speakers to lend their vision for the future of education and how we can lead in the 21st century. I would like to welcome Dr. Bryan Alexander, our opening keynote, as this year's feature presenter for the Deena M. Grossmann Memorial Lecture in Education. This memorial lecture was established by the Grossmann family to honor the memory of their late daughter, Deena. Deena was the very first graduate of Gratz's Master of Arts in Jewish Education program. She had a distinguished career as a Jewish educator, serving as an educational leader in Maine and in Texas. Tragically, in 1993, she died from an incurable form of cancer. In her life, Deena was dugma, an example to others. She had an inner spark that propelled her and those around her. Through the annual Deena M. Grossmann Memorial Lecture in Education, the family hopes to keep her memory alive so that others may benefit and be inspired by her legacy. The Grossmann family's connection to Gratz College spans 2 generations. Deena's parents, Miriam and the late Saul Grossmann, are both alumni who met one another at Gratz. Miriam completed a master's in Jewish studies in 1988 and a bachelor's of Hebrew literature in 1951, which laid the foundation for her career as a Hebrew school teacher. Saul concluded his successful lifelong career as a Philadelphia educator by teaching one of Gratz's first online courses. On behalf of Gratz, I would like to thank Miriam Grossmann and her family for establishing this lecture in loving tribute to their extraordinary daughter, Deena. As I mentioned, this year's opening keynote is Bryan Alexander. Bryan is an award-winning, internationally known futurist, researcher, writer, speaker, consultant, and teacher working in the field of higher education's future. Bryan is currently the senior scholar at Georgetown University and teaches graduate seminars in their Learning, Design, and Technology program. He recently published Academia Next, The Futures of Higher Education for Johns Hopkins University Press in 2020, which won the Association of Professional Futurists Awards. It is my pleasure to welcome Bryan Alexander.
Thank you so much, Donna, and thank you very much for the introduction, Honor Moore. By the way, I really admire your background. I would love to spend time in that book-lined room. Can everyone hear me all right? If you can just either make a noise or share something in the chat. Excellent, excellent, very good. Thank you all for coming on a Sunday afternoon. Thank you all, especially for inviting me to participate in this honorable tradition. I'm delighted to have a chance to talk with you. What I'm going to do now for the next roughly 45 minutes is walk you through some of the major ideas about the future of higher education and what that means for all of you. And I would love to hear your thoughts. So if you can, please use the chat box. If you can't access that, please hold on. We have questions at the end. And I would really, really like to hear your comments, your examples, your howls of outrage, and your cries of support. Now, to begin, let me put up the traditional PowerPoint. And this is a university in Egypt that I haven't visited, but I just love the name and I can't get enough of it. So let me explain. Thinking about the future of education always brings up the question of what is the future and what does it mean to think about the future? This meme is one of my favorites. I turn to this quite frequently because it does a good job of expressing the different ideas we have about future and futurists. You know, on the top left, you have the idea of something occult or magical. On the top middle, we have the idea of a focus on technology. And on the bottom is actually closer to what I think I actually do, is putting pieces of a gigantic puzzle together and instilling curiosity in everyone who thinks about this. Now, let me just give you some ideas about the future, just to get you started and help you think about it. And note the fiery red S on this slide. We prefer to think about the future as a plural event because there are billions of people in an incredible variety of situations and circumstances, and they will all have really, really different experiences. So one thing to think about is that our modern idea of the future goes back a few centuries. Perhaps as far back as the great science fiction foundational novel, Frankenstein, which offers us the first look at a modern technology trying to imagine the future. But we should also remember that Mary Shelley's last book, The Last Man, is actually all about prophecy and about trying to imagine a future thousands of years in the future. Ever since the 20th century, we've had a whole variety of groups trying to produce futures knowledge. The Rand Corporation, for example, is very famous for producing forecasts. We've had a whole series of books starting in the middle of the 20th century, going right up to the present. And we've had some famous thinkers like Alvin Toffler and his wife Heidi, who have really transformed the way we think about what comes next. In fact, now the futurist profession has an incredible range of tools and methods that we can deploy, each of these backed up by scholarship. We have multiple associations, professional groups, professional publications. It's a thin but widespread professional field. And it already has its language, of course, like any field. We often try to avoid the word prediction and prefer the word forecast in order to keep in mind the possibilities. We think about foresight as something that gives a strategic advantage. And we're already used to a whole series of not just memes, but shapes. Some of you may be familiar with the Gartner hype cycle, which is one of the more reliable, if somewhat sarcastic tools for trying to forecast where given technology will head. And of course, science fiction gives us so many ways of thinking about the future. Indeed, I think that if you're not reading science fiction, you're really not prepared for the rest of the 21st century. Now, I don't want to make you all think that we've discovered the golden key to what comes next. There are all kinds of problems and obstacles in our path. One of them being that people can't agree on what a good future is or what a bad future is. Famously, one person's utopia can be someone else's dystopia and vice versa. So that's another reason for thinking about plural futures. There are many, many different ways of organizing this. Furthermore, we as a species tend to be pretty lousy at anticipating what are called black swans. This is Nicholas Taleb's great idea of a statistically improbable event that when it does happen, has enormous implications, and we often use it to backfill and think that we anticipated it all along. And there are plenty of examples of black swans: the 2008 financial crash, nearly every world religion of the past 2,000 years, and so on. Furthermore, we do tend to get excited about the future and overestimate the short-term impact of changes. And we also tend to underestimate the persistence of older behaviors, protocols, strategies, technologies, and practices. This is one of my favorite books, an incredibly grim and sarcastic book, which keeps pointing out that whenever we add some new technology to the world, we keep using the old ones to some degree. Now, in my own work, I focus on the future of higher education, which should be of some interest to all of you on this call, and that I pursue through a whole number of different axes and projects under the header, the Future of Education Observatory. One of them is publishing scholarly books. Donna was kind enough to mention my previous book, Academia Next, which I'm going to refer to later on. I also do a lot of trends analysis, which is taking a look at forces in the recent past and the current present, which hope to reshape higher education. And I'll talk about a few of these today. Some of them have to do with education and its context, some with technology, and some with the blend of how technology and education intersect. So let's take a look at these. And let's start off by zooming way out. Let's take a very, very large picture. Think about the globe and think about what geopolitics might mean for higher education. So I have two different scenarios for you. One is a scenario I call world university. And this is the idea that a given college or university should be a kind of network node for the entire planet. That if you go to a university, you should be surrounded by people from multiple nationalities, multiple religions, multiple ethnicities, multiple genders. That in fact, to set foot on a given campus is to set foot on the entire surface of the globe. And this involves students, this involves faculty and staff, and this has been a major driver for higher education, well, possibly for the past 1,000 years, but especially for the past 30 years. Now, opposing this is the idea of what some call the national college, and this is the idea of the campus should instead focus on its locality, its local nation, its local region, its community, and try to preserve those folkways, those ways of knowing, and try to serve that population as much as possible. There are politics behind that. You could think of conservative politicians around the world who are very big fans of this approach, but it tends to play out in all kinds of interesting and different ways. For example, right now around the world, the rising language of instruction in universities is English, and yet there's pushback every couple of years from different countries. Here we can point to South Africa, we can point to Holland, as well as Italy, where the academics, so not exactly right-wing politicians, but the academics press for students to learn the local language on site rather than to rely on English. I'd like you to keep in mind those two possible futures for the university, and they'll play out in all kinds of different ways. Now, the globalization of higher education had paused pretty heavily during the pandemic for obvious reasons. In the United States, we've actually suffered from a drop in international students, partly because of the pandemic, partly because of the perception that the United States is unfriendly to immigrants, and also perception of the United States as being incredibly violent. It's likely we'll be dealing with that for some time to come. Now, beyond this, we can also think about the impact of the biggest geopolitical factor in the world right now on higher education. And this is what some have called the new Cold War between the United States and China. Excuse me. I don't have time to go into the details of that great, enormous context for right now, but I do want to point out that this plays out in academic ways in some interesting vectors. For example, both Beijing and Washington are trying to assemble global coalitions to support their cause and participate in their systems. You can see here, for example, one of many diagrams of the One Belt, One Road policy. But those are ways that also impact higher education. For example, China's One Belt, One Road includes an academic component where universities trade students and financial support across this network. In the United States, we are trying to encourage students from alliance nations such as Australia, Japan, and India to participate in our academia. And at the same time, we are becoming a little bit skeptical or restrictive about Chinese participation in academia. So this great division of the world may play out in our campuses, in our departments, and in individual careers. Furthermore, of course, more broadly in the news, we have the war between Russia and Ukraine, which involves NATO. And this also has implications in similar ways, having to do with alliances and where we work. Now, in the futurist toolbox, one of the most reliable tools is demographics. And this is another global, huge picture trend, and it's one that really impacts higher education in ways I think we're still struggling to grasp. Let me give you a little bit of background on this. What you're looking at in this chart is a population analysis of Nigeria a few years ago, divided by age. And you can see in the left column, you can see that the very bottom are people aged 0 to 4, then 5 to 9, 10 to 14, and so on. And with a glance, you can see that Nigeria produced a ton of babies and infants, and then mortality set in. So you have more infants than you have teenagers, more teenagers than people in their 20s, and so on, up until you have a very small number of elders. Now, this is Nigeria in 2020. This is also what most of human history looked like until around 1900. Once we changed civilization. Once we started building modernity, demographics flipped. Take a look at this. Here's Germany in the same period. And you can see that there are more people in their 20s than teenagers, more people in their 30s than 20s, more people in their 50s than absolutely anything else. And we know exactly the reasons why this happened. This is not controversial. We know that you have growth in economics, and then we know that we have expansions in medical science as well as public health. And in particular, women receive a few things. Women receive careers outside of the home, women receive education, and women also receive access to reproductive capacity. Once you have all of those in place, that pyramid that we saw before in Nigeria flips upside down. And this has happened in almost every single country, almost every single population on Earth. And you can see it playing out in mid-process. Here's Ecuador right now. You can see the traditional pyramid down to about 20, and then the pyramid flipping right after that. In the United States, we are very much in that modernity space. The only thing that keeps us from having a flipped pyramid is that we get a lot of immigration, and immigrants tend to be younger. So why does this matter? Why does this matter? Well, it matters for a few reasons. And one of the reasons it matters is because it changes our social economic framework in ways that we don't quite understand yet, because this is brand new in society. What does it mean to have fewer and fewer kids and to have more and more seniors? What does this do with the economics of supporting retirees? What does this do with a nation's self-image? What does this do to war when you have fewer people of military age, and so on? But also plays out differently geopolitically. In this map here, you can see the nations that are blue are still producing kids at scale, whereas the nations that are yellow, orange, or red have gone through the process I described. In fact, let me just zero in on this. You can see that the nations that are still producing kids tend to be in sub-Saharan Africa. You get a little bit in Southeast Asia, you get Afghanistan and Pakistan, Mongolia, but the big population growth areas are sub-Saharan Africa. If you are looking for the demographic future, this is where it's going to be, not anywhere else. Why does this matter for education? Well, I just described a force changing all of society, and education swims in that society, so there's that. But also, you think about the extent to which a college like Graz teaches traditional age undergraduates. That 18-year-old population is starting to shrink, and it's going to continue to shrink. In fact, in the United States, it's already starting to shrink in some severe ways. Here I'm drawing on the work of my friend Nathan Groh, and you can see the states here that are in red, orange, or yellow are the ones that are producing fewer and fewer kids. And at a glance, you can see the Northeast and Midwest and big chunks of the South are really starting to shrink. And even in the West, I mean, California plateaued for the first time in its history. Now, Nathan refers to the arc from Texas to North Dakota as Fertility Alley, and that may be true. In fact, I'm really enjoying the comedy of seeing Tony New England colleges marketing themselves for the first time in Texas, which is kind of cultural comedy gold. But the point is that this is really starting to change higher education. It means that the colleges in those red, orange, and yellow zones have to compete more intensively. It means they're going to be losing some revenue from enrollment. And it means that public universities have to rethink their entire strategy and purpose. Meanwhile, Nathan also points out that starting around 2025, 2026, this is going to get even sharper. And that's because in 2008, the big financial crash then caused quite a few people not to have kids. I mean, even more sharply than what I've described so far. So if you just do the math, if you add up 18 from 2008, that's when you start to see that 18-year-old pipeline get even narrower. So we have to think about this in higher education, how we respond. How do we compete more effectively? Do we recruit more aggressively from sub-Saharan Africa? Do we instead try to teach more and more adult learners? These are some of the big questions of our time. Now, also in that population mix, a fact that's better known is that the United States is becoming more diverse. And what this really means is the white population is continuing to decline, both in absolute numbers and in relative terms. And certain other populations are continuing to grow. That is in particular Asians and especially Hispanics. That leads our nation to becoming more and more diverse, which of course is the source of all kinds of politics and social turmoil right now. And in higher education, we have to rethink all kinds of aspects of this. This really took hold in 2020 with the George Floyd murder and the following protests and mobilization. The what some call the Great Awakening or the Great Awokening has led much of higher education to rethink its approach to race. Just quickly, for example, there have been mobilizations to reform our curriculum, how we staff, how we handle professional development, who's represented in our administration, how we handle student support, and even to change buildings on our campus grounds. Now, that population is changing in another way, which has a huge impact on higher education. And that is, we often think about the typical college student as being an 18-year-old. Well, that is true to some extent, except we have, depending on your number, 1/4 to 1/3 of the population are adults who have different needs pedagogically in terms of support. We have a growing number of first-generation students for reasons I'm going to explain in a minute. And first-generation students often have a very difficult time trying to grapple with our peculiar bureaucracy. In fact, I've heard in the City University of New York system, there's a term called to be cunified. And that's when you get caught up in the bureaucracy. You know, one official tells you one thing and another official tells you another. What happened? I've been cunified. Well, if your parents or family members have had experience in colleges and universities, it's easier to overcome that. But if not, you need more help. We also have a large number of veterans because the United States has finished, or in some ways is still fighting, its longest war ever. And veterans have their own needs. And beyond that, we have a growing number of students who have learning disabilities of various kinds along the autism spectrum for reasons only partially understood. If you wrap these all up, we have a richer, more challenging, and more expensive population to serve. Now, that population is changing in another way. And just quick show of hands here or a quick reaction. Am I going too fast, too slow, or am I in the Goldilocks and the Three Bears just right moment? So, so speaking of muting, one of the other transformations that's been occurring in the United States is something which has been anticipated for 150 years and is finally starting to occur, which is that a growing proportion of Americans are religiously unaffiliated. That is, they describe themselves as agnostic, atheist, or anything else but belonging to a given religious institution. And this has really taken off since about 2000. It's strongly marked by age, which is traditional, but especially it's a very, very large number right now. Indeed, there's a lot of talk about the impact of this on next year's election. And why this matters for higher education. Well, in part, it matters for curriculum and research to the extent that we teach and study and research religion. But also, we have a good number of institutions like yours, which have some degree of religious affiliation. And so we have to figure out how to maintain that connection to students if that proportion of students is starting to fall. And I'm happy to try to go back to this, by the way, in question or any of these points in Q&A, because there's just it's really, really interesting how this has changed. Now, in higher education, and so far I've been talking around higher education, I've been talking about the society in which we swim and the society that you'll be serving as researchers and as students and as teachers. But also the population in higher education is changing in a few different ways. And one of the most important and underappreciated is the scope, the size of our student body. See, from about 1983 to 2012, we enjoyed an incredible expansion in higher education. The total number of students just ballooned for those decades. And there's no name for that period. Clay Shirky at NYU thinks we should call it the golden age, and that's not a bad idea. But it's an enormous success, a huge triumph for higher education. And then in 2012, it stopped. And in fact, afterwards, every year, every semester, the population of students in higher education has gone down bit by bit, gradually. And in fact, right now we went from something over 20,000, and we're down to about 80% of that right now. And why this matters? Well, there are all kinds of reasons. I mean, one is the economics of it. The higher education depends heavily on enrollment for revenue. So fewer students means less revenue, which is a problem. But also it matters if our culture is committed to the idea of everybody getting some post-secondary education. We're now failing that commitment. We're in fact going backwards. And these numbers, by the way, include international students as well. Now, the students who do enroll are changing their majors in some very, very interesting ways. And believe me, as I show you this chart, keep in mind, my PhD is in English literature, so I'm not sharing this with any kind of self-hating joy here. The key thing to know is that students are moving towards STEM and business fields and away from the arts and humanities. I'm not going to walk you through this entire graph. I just want to show you the top right and the bottom left of it. This measures changes in degrees awarded. If you look at the very, very top right of this, you can see the fields that are just booming: computer science, nursing, exercise science, computer and electrical engineering, health and medical. And you can see those are fields that are growing by leaps and bounds by more than 50, 100%. I mean, incredible success story. Then if you look at the very bottom left of the screen, you look at the ones especially that have little purple dots: religion, humanities, area studies, history, English, languages other than language, and they're dropping by 10, 20, 30, 40%. And we can talk about the reasons for this, and we can talk about what this means for society and what this means for education. I just want to point this out right now to describe a future for higher education, which is every university, every college has to think about staffing, has to think about its curriculum, to what extent they're able to devote resources to the fields where students are actually headed, and if they're going to be reducing resources to the fields where students are not. Now, one last point, and I'm going to show you my most terrifying slide in just a minute here, is that all of this happens in the context of big macroeconomic changes. And there's a lot going on here. Some of them have to do with the workplace. And that is, we're in the United States in the middle of a long, long transition away from people working in industry to people working in the service field instead. Now, this is a little tricky to grasp because it's not what we were expecting. And also, we do produce a lot of industry in the United States. We do produce a ton of stuff. It just employs relatively few people. We also thought that we'd be working in the creative industries or in the information industries. And while those industries are large in terms of market capitalization, they employ very, very few people in the United States. So really the big sector in the US is the service economy. We're also shifting in terms of workplace stability away from long-term work to the gig economy. And along the way, there are a lot of stops, including some people working multiple jobs, multiple employers, multiple careers in the same lifetime. And on top of this, we're seeing that more and more jobs across the board have greater requirements for technology. And the technology can be anything from having to make video, to having to code, to having to just use spreadsheets and work with data. So all of this depicts a very, very different workforce. And what's interesting is higher education was in many ways designed for the previous workforce. Let me explain. Here's that scary chart. This is a map of income inequality. And this is drawn from the work of people like Thomas Piketty and Emmanuel Saïs. And what this shows is how income inequality change over time. So the horizontal axis is time. You can see it's about a century there, 1910 to about 2010. And the vertical axis is inequality. So the higher, the more unequal these societies were over time. So if we were at 100%, it would mean Jeff Bezos owns everything and we own nothing, right? And you can see at a glance, around 1910, we were pretty unequal. And then from about 1915 to about 1960, we became increasingly less unequal economically. And the reasons are pretty clear. We had 2 world wars, which destroyed a huge amount of wealth, among other things. We had a Great Depression, which was worldwide, and which did the same as well. And we had the rise of a whole series of national policies which redistributed wealth. You can think in Britain of the national health system. You could think in the US of FDR's New Deal. But as a result, from about 1960 to about 1985, we were the least unequal we'd ever been economically. In fact, the New York Times economist, Princeton economist, Paul Krugman refers to this as the Great Compression. And I just want you to pause in that trough for a second, because this is not something that we fully appreciate yet. But if you want to think about pop culture from that period, if you look at movies and TV and you read novels from that period, you'll see that the gaps between different economic classes are relatively muted compared to what went before. And also that period is when we last overhauled American higher education. That's when a whole bunch of normal schools became baccalaureate institutions. This is the birth of the huge community college system. This is when baccalaureate institutions became master's granting institutions, when doctoral institutions just blossomed. And this is when we first had student loans. And this is when we decided that, everybody should get some college. But look at the last third of this graph. From around 1985 to the present, income and wealth inequality surged and surged again, and hasn't stopped rising. And right now, This is called a U-shaped graph because we're back in 1910. We're back in 1900. A Swiss reinsurance company calls our time the New Gilded Age, referring to the 1890s. So why does this matter? Well, first, this helps explain why higher education feels a bit disoriented and disjointed. So we were last designed for a time that no longer exists. Also, this has implications for everything. Think about your students and what jobs they're looking for. If you go to the top 20 or 30 universities and colleges in the country, they're often pretty explicit about it. They'll say, get a degree from us and you'll enter the 1%. Other colleges will do that in a more sneaky way. But also even think about fundraising. To what extent are we going to be increasingly dependent on the gifts of the 1% of the 1%? I'm going to come back to this, and I'm happy to say more about this if you like. Now, one side effect of that change was the increasing scope of the financial sector. And that plays out directly in American higher education because we decided to financialize the funding of higher education. That is, students spend increasingly large amounts of money in debt and debt service and debt payments. And in fact, the total amount of student debt is closing in on $2 trillion. It's the second largest source of debt in the United States. It's bigger than what we owe for cars. It's bigger than credit card debt. It's second only to house notes. No other country has done this at anywhere near this scale. The US is unique in this sector. And of course, this has all kinds of implications. It's a major political issue, as we saw the recent Supreme Court decision. This has implications on student mentality, their morale, but also on their own finances. They become less likely to reproduce, less likely to have more capital investment. I'm happy to say more about this, but nothing is slowing this bolus of debt down at all. Now, in higher ed, we have a sneaky thing, and I'm not sure all of you have faced this, but I want to make sure you know about this. This looks a little like inside baseball, but this is actually a very powerful secret. Higher education is famous for our high prices, our big sticker prices. And that's only true really for about a quarter of our institutions, but we're famous for that or notorious for it. But in reality, most students don't pay the sticker price. Most universities and colleges discount that sticker price for students for various reasons, including merit and need. And that discount has been exploding. And right now, if you can see here, look on the right edge, a lot of private universities, they discount more than 50%. So if your college charges $50,000 a year, it means the median student pays maybe $24,000 instead. This is a way of grappling with that income inequality I showed you before. It means that we can charge full freight to the families that are in that 1% while discounting for everyone else. All right, last picture. Maybe this is a scarier slide. And that has to do with an increasing political dimension about higher education. Higher education has always been political for 1,000 years, always been political in the United States. The politics of it now are very interesting. From around 2000 to about 2010, there was a kind of bipartisan consensus that everyone needed more higher education needed support, although state governments were cutting that funding. But then things started to break. On the conservative side, there are more and more people who are happy to express the disdain and outright hatred for higher education. And the irony, of course, is that a lot of leading politicians, like the one on the left here, are the products of the most elite higher education. And this is starting to have effects on popular opinion, whereas right now higher education is now very controversial in the American mind. There is a lot to be concerned about this, especially as politicians like DeSantis there on the left, or Governor Abbott in Texas have passed laws that are regulating higher education, everything from DEI to hiring, even to curriculum. And this is another trend that we have to watch. All right. I've been talking about all these forces around higher education. I'm going to switch over to technology in a minute, but I want to answer a couple of quick questions that have come up. One is from anonymous attendee who says, what are Dr. Alexander's thoughts on why criminology and economics are bucking the trend of the humanities and social sciences in terms of degrees awarded? Good question. Economics, because business is huge. Business is in many ways the most popular major in the US, and people like to take economics as part of that, especially seeing that as a way towards an MBA or some executive position. So economics has that side effect. Criminology, in part, I think because America is unusually excited about crime. We have an enormous apparatus of judiciary and penology, which needs a lot of staffing. And I think that is simply going to remain popular, even though we have a large number of population which are very skeptical of that process. So those are my quick thoughts about that. Good question. Moshe Barides, Moshe, if I mispronounced your last name, please forgive me, has a question. Dr. Alexander showed a chart regarding religious unaffiliation that is growing. Why is that? And where and how do you see it? This is the subject of a great deal of controversy and scholarship right now, Moshe, in the religious community and the religious studies world. Part of it is reaction against the Catholic sex abuse, clerical sex abuse scandals. In fact, I've seen more than a few Catholic universities that are suffering from declining enrollment as a result, and have often tried to change their mission to describe it in a different way. I think partly as well, we're seeing some kind of backlash from a sense of technology becoming ever more popular in the United States. Science and technology playing out against religion is a pretty popular dimension. And on top of that, I think we're also seeing an age gap where the religiously affiliated tend to be older and older, whereas the people who are religiously unaffiliated tend to be younger and younger. So that may be a strict generational divide. Great question. Happy to say more. Kaylin Stoner says, hello, Kaylin. What are you seeing for first generation graduate students, as they often have similar issues as first time undergraduate students? Kaylin, great question, and not enough. There is not enough help. They're not signaled out for more attention. They really should be, especially in the master's field, where we have a larger number than the PhD field. We should have more support for first generation graduate students. Higher education is in many ways an illegible field for people new to it. Laurie King says, economist sociologist Joseph Stiglitz. Yes, great guy. Started exploring the concept of a new Gilded Age back in 2002. Indeed, the disparity has only gotten worse. Yes, Laurie, I'm a big fan of Stiglitz. Always read and listen to this guy. I think in many ways we had a bubble from around 2008 to about 2013 when we really paid attention to economic inequality. The financial collapse of 2008, the insurgent campaign of Bernie Sanders in 2015, 2016. We had the Occupy movement. And I think that's kind of fallen off the radar in many ways. It appeared again in the Green New Deal, but that's more often the progressive segment of politics. But yeah, I'm so glad to hear you cite Stiglitz. Definitely an American hero for me on this. Great. Love these questions. Love these questions. Happy to see more. But now I'm going to push on the technology. And I just want to know, I'm showing you a picture of a drone with a chainsaw. Why? I don't have to explain it. It's just awesome. Actually, one of the reasons this is interesting for me is because it's Finnish. And Finland is always on the cutting edge, if you'll forgive the pun, of technology. There are all kinds of dimensions for how technology is impacting higher education. And we can just really spend the next day talking about that. I want to hit a couple of high notes and focus on a couple of key things. A lot of these have to do with automation. And automation hits us in two different ways. One that's very big and one that's very medium-sized. The very big way is an open question now. And again, Laurie mentioning Stiglitz has some good thoughts on this, is we don't know what automation is going to do to the labor market. See, historically, for 150, maybe 200 years, whenever we've invented some new technology, it has caused unemployment in some current field, but then built a bigger employment base afterwards. So you think about the horse and buggy, too bad for them when we invented the car, but we built entire cities and global industries that are much, much larger. Joseph Schumpeter, the economist, called this creative destruction. That's been the pattern up until around 1990. So it's possible that automation will do the same thing, that we'll lose truck drivers and taxi drivers, but instead grow a huge industry supporting them, supporting autonomous and self-driving cars. On the other hand, it's possible that we won't. Digital technology employs very, very few people, especially on the software side. And it may be that we end up with widespread underemployment or straight up unemployment. Well, we could see a time when most people have long periods of unemployment in their lives, or the hours per week drops to 40 or 35 or 30. That's another possibility. But the one I'd like you to think about is what you see here in this fun photo of a Canadian technologist shaking hands with a robot, which is the idea of collaboration between humans and technology. Some call the cyborg model, some call the centaur model. But the idea is that we don't have a lot of autonomous automation working well. We need to have humans in the loop. If you look at jet aircraft, for example, as well as propeller aircraft, pilots actually do relatively little work in terms of hours because so much is automated right now. But we need humans in the loop in order to take care of unusual situations and circumstances. And this is where self-driving cars are right now. They're pretty good or okay for most situations, unless something weird happens. And something weird does happen, given the nature of American drivers. So it may be going forward that the economy is based on people working really closely with technology. Now, that's a big change in the overall economy. The medium-sized change has to do with higher education. So, for example, if I'm right about the cyborg or centaur model, then our operations will become even more cyborgy and centaur-y. Faculty will have to teach with a lot more technology, but also we'll have to prepare students for that kind of workforce. So a poli-sci major is going to have to learn a lot more in terms of stats and stats analysis. Writing students will have to learn more AI and so on. So those are a lot of changes to think about. Again, I'm happy to drill down on this in a great deal of detail if you like. But at the same time, we have the recent explosion of generative AI. And I've been writing a lot about this and talking about this. And let me just say a couple of quick things. One is that it's possible that enough people who want to learn stuff, who would have gone to college, can now learn enough through generative AI that this will depress enrollment in higher education. To pick one early example, the language learning app Duolingo is a sufficient quality that it can replace to some extent some language classes, depending on the user and depending on their sense of value. We can now train ChatGPT and other tools to serve as tutors very easily, to serve as simulation managers, to serve as guides to a curriculum. And this technology is simply improving right now. So it's possible that we're going to see a further drop in enrollment. Second, we're still figuring out how to integrate this technology into higher education. And that's a gigantic problem because we really don't know how to. There's an enormous potential for cheating, which we have no control over right now. We're trying, but failing miserably. But also the creative uses for technology in the classroom are really extensive. There's a lot more we can do. So at the same time, this technology is kind of fragile. That is, it's suffering a series of legal challenges as well as policy challenges, and we may see attitudinal changes. There's a lot of resentment of new AI and automation that may pause or retard its growth. Now, I'm happy to say more about this and to come back to it. One more change, if I can take a step back a couple of years, it's important to think about the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, in part because we don't know its impact on higher education. We do not have data about how many academics were sickened or killed by COVID. We just don't have that data, which is atrocious, but there it is. We're still, as a society, doing our best not to think about COVID in any conceivable way. Just like 100 years ago, we moved away from the Spanish flu in a hurry. We're doing the same thing right now with COVID. But one thing I want you to take away from it is the fact that we were hurt. We were injured, physically at times, as well as mentally. But on top of this, we did something truly extraordinary. We shifted our campuses online. And I don't want to brag here. I just want to share this part here because it got a lot of attention. Academia Next, I wrote this 2017 through 2019. It came out the end of 2019, early 2020. And in it, I have a chapter where I try and get people to think expansively about the future of higher education. And there's this one page where I say, well, imagine what would happen if a gigantic pandemic struck the world, along the lines of the early 20th century great influenza. We have to rethink how it impacts multiple disciplines. We have to think about how this changes learning, how distance learning grows, what happens to conferences and moving them online, and so on. Naturally, no one paid attention to page 23 until about 3 years ago. And then people have been coming after me. Alexander, what did you know? What dark forces are you in league with? The fact is that in the futures field, in the public health field, we've been expecting pandemics like this for a long time, and more are due to come. So you have to plan for that coming up. But also, we did something really interesting. We shifted our entire apparatus online and then kind of back. But in between, we found an intermediary zone. And that intermediary zone, call it blended, call it high flex, call it what you like, is increasingly a kind of baseline for our operations, where you have a meeting and one person is remote. You have a presentation, some of the audience is online. You have a class, one person can't make it because of visa issues. increasingly our experience is blended in that way. We have to plan on that. It's not easy to do. It's more expensive. It requires more support. But we have to keep an eye out for this because this is probably just going to grow. Now, I want to hit with the biggest driver of change. But before I do that, I want to answer a couple of quick questions. Rebecca Fable asks, how does ChatGPT factor into this digital age? I think I touched on a little bit there, Rebecca, in terms of ChatGPT helping with generate writing and helping to generate, to act as a simulation guide as well as a tutor. I'm happy to see more about that. Amanda Kirk asked, what is the forecast impact on population, the rising anti-reproductive rights laws? Great question, Amanda. One impact is that we may see a slight increase in birth rate in the reddest states with the highest prohibitions, and we may see a further decline in birth rate in the other states, as well as perhaps overall, especially as women become increasingly terrified of the specter of forced birth. Moishi follows up with saying, adding comment regarding technology, one big advantage is it gives you the option to work or study from home. Absolutely. Absolutely. And we're seeing that happen in the workplace right now, which is very, very controversial. Kaylin Stoner says, Grammarly is a popular AI that has improved by leaps and bounds. It's helped a lot of people, including me, become better writers. You have to understand that it's an extension, not a replacement. Exactly, Kaylin. That's why I use the cyborg metaphor, or the centaur metaphor, where that's the extension, that combination of technology and human. Grammarly is a great example of that. Parish Conkling, I hope I have your name there right. We have seen so much cheating with GPT at my school that we are moving away from assigning writing people altogether. Cheating in undergraduate online classes is so prevalent that most of us just accept it. What are the long-term consequences of this, in your opinion? Parish, right now, first, the short-term consequences are there are a lot of faculty, I don't know what proportion, but a good number, are following the example you described. They're giving more classroom presentations, more oral exams, more even pen and paper, back to old blue books. We're also seeing more intensive proctoring. So following that field becomes pretty nightmarish at times, where people are instructed to basically be online with only the thinnest of pipes to the outside world. So we may see more of that. It's possible that we'll experience a degradation of the value of an American or anyone else's college degree as people become more and more suspicious that it's increasingly fraudulent. There is an arms race in detection and prevention, which is going on. There are a bunch of startups as well as some established companies trying to figure out ways of detecting bot-generated text. So far, they are not very successful, but that is something which we're going to see more of. It's possible that we'll also see more campuses go backwards and just shut off rooms, black box the rooms for exam purposes. But yeah, this is the thing we're going to be grappling with right now as we try to design classes for the fall. Good question. Good question. And Jade, thank you for sharing a link to my video. Really appreciate that. I publish videos pretty commonly, pretty frequently, especially because of my weekly Future Transform video conference. So let me hit the last idea. And this is the biggest one. This is the largest challenge. And I'm going to go through this in a hurry because I'm conscious of time and I'm happy to say more about it. Which has to do with climate change. This is the subject of my new book, which came out in March, University is on Fire, the first monograph on the topic. And there's a lot to say. And I can't go into it in great detail, and I especially can't talk about climate change per se right now, because it's going to take us way off topic. But higher education engages with the climate crisis on multiple domains in terms of our physical grounds, our research mission, our teaching mission, and community relation. So really quickly, if you look at a physical campus, if you look at everything from administrative buildings, classrooms, residence halls, and so forth, we have to start rethinking a lot of stuff. Our buildings, to what extent they serve as CO2 generators. We think of where we get our electrical power from. Do we get it from facilities that burn coal or oil? Our transportation, to what extent do our vehicles that a campus owns burn fossil fuels? And do we support people who come to our campuses with other forms of technology for transportation? Our food, to what extent do we provide food and or teach food making that emits both carbon as well as methane? And for campuses that are physically in danger, they have to rethink their location. Just to give you a quick example of what I'm talking about, if we look at one dimension of climate change, which is sea level rise, you can find a lot of maps like this, which just try to project where sea level rise could go, especially if certain parts of the world lose a lot of glacial covering, like Greenland or Antarctica. And here's one where by 2100, you can imagine a substantial sea level rise. But in terms of higher education, just run your eyes down the coastline of the United States here. Look at Boston, New York, Philadelphia, the Northeast, which is chock-a-block with higher education facilities, and how much of that is underwater. Look south of Washington, down the East Coast. Florida is just gone. There's a huge inland sea in New Orleans, north of New Orleans. Think about all those colleges and universities. Look at the West Coast. Look at the inland sea inside of San Francisco and so on. In fact, let's just take the most extreme example, which is Florida. State of Florida already decided to give up some of the Florida Keys to sea level rise and to protect other ones. So they've already made that policy decision. In fact, Miami, the city of Miami, or the county of Miami-Dade, is going through an interesting process of trying to protect itself against sea level rise. They're in a lousy situation. They are at sea level, and they have a lot of limestone rock, which holds a lot of water. And Miami right now suffers from what's called daylight flooding, whereas the city will sometimes just flood, even if there's no rain outside. So let's take a look at what this means for higher education. Here are a bunch of colleges and universities in Miami, close to the Atlantic. And you can see there's just a couple of dozen right there. In fact, if we zoom in, we look at the ocean itself and a couple of blocks away, you can look at campuses that are no doubt very proud of their location on the beaches. So what do they have to do? Do they have to elevate their buildings on pylons? Do they have to build a seawall to protect themselves? Or do they move somewhere else? There are a lot of examples of colleges and universities in nature like that. One dimension of this has to do with our use of jet aircraft. Higher education has a lot of flying attached to it. Faculty and staff fly for a lot of professional meetings, for jobs, for conferences, for research. Students fly for breaks and so on. And air travel is a horrible generator of CO2. So do we decide to fly less? We could do that. We already know how. We've done that during the pandemic. We can shift to webinars. We can just have more high flex meetings. But there's a lot of resistance to this for various reasons, and there's a lot of inequality in it. Furthermore, you think about our research. We have new fields emerging and current fields at work. In fact, across the disciplines, people researching this, from the sciences through the social sciences, the humanities. And then when we try to support this research, it becomes even more challenging because so much of that research is threatened by climate change. You think, for example, about oceanic researchers who are trying to study the ocean, or biologists trying to study sea life. All of those are changing as the oceans heat up and as currents shift. You think, for example, about trying to study archives, which might be in danger of overheating or desertification. So how do we support all of those researchers? And then how do we protect our researchers from the politics around climate change? Moreover, in our teaching mission, it seems pretty clear to me that the rising generation is fascinated by climate change and very concerned about it. So we may teach more about it. And that becomes an interesting question of which disciplines will be involved. I mean, potentially all of them. You can teach climate change in just about every field that moves, but it's an open question if an institution will support that and the faculty will support it. Also, how they'll support interdisciplinary study in this field. Also, how they'll support the pedagogies of the field, because teaching an incredibly complex system like this may require project-based learning or inquiry-based learning, may require greater usage of simulations and gaming. And furthermore, how are we going to teach students who are increasingly coming from the experience of climate trauma? And as refugees start to move around the world, every study of this looks at tens of millions of climate refugees in the next generation, and then more on top of that. How are we going to handle people who exit Nigeria or leave the American Southeast or who leave much of the Middle East and North Africa? Are campuses ready to physically house them or to teach them? I'm talking about this like it's a conscious effort by higher education to make a decision, but it's more complicated than that because we have all kinds of division. We have faculty who benefit directly from oil. We have trustees, ditto. And we have students who are very, very concerned. Take a look at this slogan. I keep seeing this again and again in protests. You'll die of old age, we'll die of climate change. Do you think a student like that will be patient with us if we take 5 years to come up with a plan to design the next plan for climate thinking? Or will they be the ones who take to the streets or who throw food at European artwork? I mean, it may be that we have a political dimension in higher education over climate change like we saw in the 1960s. I need to move on. There's quite a bit we can think about for this. I mean, COVID gave us a glimpse of how we might respond to climate change in that we shut down a lot of emissions very briefly, but we also saw ways of hitting science. We saw that we were both more internationalized in some ways and less. So both of those scenarios came true. What I'd like to do now is just pause. And I want to pause with a few positive notes, just to give you a sense of some optimism in case this is too terrifying right now. So here, let me just pause. The future looks like a VUCA world, as they say in the military: volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. But we have a lot of positive features. We have a lot of good things we can count on. Whoop, excuse me. We have our students who can serve as co-creators to work with us, and our students are living through these changes in ways that the rest of us are not. We can collaborate across academia in ways that cut across silos and boundaries. We can also rededicate ourselves to teaching and learning, to improving the quality of that, which is a great thing. And we can do so with a sense of social justice and with equity, which is long overdue. Here's a quote I want to leave you with. This is from an Indian writer, Arundhati Roy, who was talking about the pandemic, but I think these thoughts resonate beyond. Historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. This is no different. It is a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. We can choose to walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and hatred, our avarice, our databanks and dead ideas, our dead rivers and smoky skies behind us. Or we can walk through it lightly, with little luggage, ready to imagine another world and ready to fight for it. All right, I'm going to stop showing slides. I want you to think about that last charge. I want you to think about all these different trends that we've been talking about. And as you're thinking, I want to tackle some of your questions. Sammy Feynman says, are there any new technologies that are able to actually create PowerPoint presentations as well? Yeah, take a look at slides.gpt. Excuse me, slides.gpt. That's what it does. It creates a 10 to 12 slide show right away. That's done by a couple of guys as a startup. You'll see more that are better. Meanwhile, Microsoft is including AI in its Office suite, so you should see AI tools in PowerPoint as well. I don't know what Apple is doing with Keynote. It may have fallen behind on that. Chana Luchin says, I wonder about the confluence of being less religious, technological support, and the changes in people's mental health. I also wonder about the fundamental of deep relationship building needed for children from birth to 10. If these changes can be beneficial for that cohort. What are your thoughts? Oh, Chana, I love the way you think. This is great. I think right now we may have the opportunity to devote more resources, including more people, to educating children from birth to 10, if we choose to do that. If there are fewer of them, we have current capacity, we might be able to do a better job. I'm not sure we will. I think we'll cut costs on that and shrink, for example, pre-K and K through 12. But that does give us an option for doing that. Being less religious and mental health is a really knotty dynamic, a really tricky one to untangle. There's a lot going on there. And I'm actually not sure I can comment on that right now. I'm not, partly because the psychological research field right now is in huge crisis. So I'm really not sure of the reproducibility and the quality of a lot of psychological research to answer that part. And I mean, it's pretty clear that religion can produce support for mental health as well as be detrimental to mental health. I think, John, you've just identified an enormous research agenda that someone should follow up on. Jessica Rodolsky as you described the decline of humanities in higher education, how can we keep these subjects relevant? I come from a STEM background, but I'm very concerned with the lack of humanities available in higher education. I agree, Jessica. I think one way is to tackle some of these current issues and problems. For example, we saw some liberal arts colleges start to teach people about the pandemic, which is very interesting, but I think pivoting to both address technology and also to address climate change are really good ways. Let me pause for a second. Donna, there are a couple more questions, but I see the clock coming up on 2 o'clock.
Yeah.
I don't want to go over. I'd be happy to.
I think you're okay, actually. I think if you just want to answer the rest of the questions here in the Q&A, that'll be helpful. But just so everyone knows, at 4 o'clock, Bryan is going to join us for our virtual happy hour. So please come to that, and it'll be a little bit more of an intimate setting where you can follow up on some of these questions as well.
Indeed. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Gail, I think it's Grossmann says ethics have to meet the technology, so students are taught to use it appropriately. So cheating is not acceptable, no matter what the innovations are. Yeah, yeah. So you think about some of the ways we've done this in the past, and we have honor codes, for example, or we have individual faculty coming up with individual approaches. I'm not sure how successful that will be at this point. If we have students who have mental health issues, they may see trying to avoid cheating being burdensome. They may be enormously stressed, which causes people to cheat in many ways. I'm with you. I think this is a major ethical issue, but I'm not sure how students will respond to that. Kaylin Stoner says, as one of the younger people here, hello, good to see you. I believe moving away from these AI systems is a mistake in academics. They are being used in the workplace, and the school needs to learn how to equip students to use them. As STEM becomes more important, humanities students, as you mentioned, need to rise to a world dominated by STEM. I'm not saying we need to get rid of pen and paper, but schools themselves need to learn how to use these systems to their advantage. I agree. But you and I are not necessarily the majority here. A lot of academics are terrified of this. Quite a few of my peers in the humanities and the non-quantitatively intensive social sciences feel that STEM is growing unjustly or unfairly, and that they're not quite sure how to respond. I think humanities offer a fantastic way of understanding the world. What I suspect is that we're going to head more and more towards the humanities being a service field within higher education, teaching less in the way of majors and teaching fewer graduate students. But I think we do need to grapple with AI. I'm doing a lot of research on that right now, Kaylin, and I'd be happy to say more during a happy hour. Anonymous attendee says the cost of oceanfront property has never been higher. America's wealthiest families don't seem concerned about climate change destroying their investments. Are they all naive? Yes. Or is there simply a pervasive belief about human ingenuity will solve the problems of sea rise before it diminishes their financial returns? Also, yes. It's not just the wealthy who live on seafront. There's also a lot of poor people who live on seafront areas, often swamps or very silty areas too. But I think this is one of the milestones to look at, is when the price of oceanfront property starts to fall. And a driver for that might be if the federal government starts to cut back on its huge subsidy for oceanfront insurance. I think they are in many ways naive, or they're playing an odds game. They're saying, okay, I'm going to live here for 10 years. It'll be fine for 10 years and then I'll die, or I'll move out and, I'll flip it to the next person. We saw something similar to this in New Orleans and Louisiana about planning for a horrible hurricane. Year after year, decade after decade, politicians said, it's not going to happen on my watch. I'm just going to roll the dice. And then we had Katrina. I don't want to sound too bitter about this anonymous attendee, but I'm pretty frustrated about it. And higher education, I think, is making similar bad decisions right now. Gail says that she's also concerned about the future of art in our museums in the future. Very, very much so. We art majors, people in the creative arts, those numbers are dwindling, and museum support is harder and harder to arrange for. But that's on the academic side. I mean, outside of academia, it's important to remember that the humanities and the arts are enormously popular in terms of, think about, there's too much good TV to watch. I'm almost 60 years old. I could not imagine saying that when I was a teenager, right? But now there's too much storytelling, and we still produce books. We have the enormous field of computer gaming. People make movies, they make plays. We love the arts. We just don't tend to see them as popular a way of understanding them by going through academia. So we need to figure out how to turn that around. Amanda Lancaster says, do you see a more equitable future for higher ed with a rise of virtual programs or lower cost and more flexible? I do see more and more online learning. And I think the pandemic pushed that forward because it gave people more exposure to it. And we see some mega universities that are entirely or almost completely online, really, really having huge numbers. Southern New Hampshire University, for example, Central Florida University, Western Governors University, even Liberty University, they have enormous impact. And they do tend to be lower price, depending on which one you have. Will this be more equitable is a good question. There's an interesting question about what is the best pedagogical method here. Often the blended learning, the combination of online and face-to-face has the best results. So will people who are entirely face-to-face or people who are entirely online have a lesser experience. It also depends on how we value the degrees achieved from these fields. But it's possible. And right now, that small group, the self-motivated learner, the autodidact, this is a fantastic time to be alive because they have access to so much learning. Good question, Amanda. Michelle Holkman, so what about teaching students to responsibly use ChatGPT and other AI programs? I think that's what we're trying to do. But I'm not seeing a lot of professional development for this. So faculty who aren't computer scientists, how they do this is a real open question. Chiming in about museums, while it's always been a tenuous field financially, the advantage museums have is the authentic objects and experience that cannot be replicated. Yes, they are also to some extent endangered by climate change. Think about, for example, the island of Malta in the Mediterranean. There's some prehistoric artifacts that are simply astonishing to look at, and they're a few meters from the Mediterranean Sea. What do we do? Do we pick them up and relocate them, which is going to deracinate them? Do we figure out a way to protect them, maybe with a huge wall or a big shell? Or do we assume they're going to go away and we scan the heck out of them digitally so people have access to them? The questions around climate change just ramify. Donna, I've got 2:06 on my clock. And
Yeah.
I think that's it for the questions right now.
Yeah.
Should I thank everybody? In fact, I'll just do that right now. I'll thank everybody. Thank you for your patience and your attention, which are great gifts. And thank you especially for your questions, which were also splendid to receive. Thank you so much. I'm really looking forward to chatting in a couple of hours.